Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's session. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Health in High Ability Students. My name is Bill McIntyre, and I'm the Vice President of Communications at the Center for Excellence in Education. This evening, our presentation will address the health challenges of high-achieving students as they grow from high school to top-tier universities and beyond. Now, what I'd like to do is introduce our Health and High Ability Students panel participants. They're going to describe their work with high ability students. At the conclusion of my introductions, I will ask Dr. Hu, who I'm about to introduce, to begin her presentation. At that point, I will turn the screen over to her, and she will go from there, followed by Dr. Chen, then Dr. Cross, and then Andy Mahoney. So first up, we have Dr. Rona Hu, his Medical Director of the Acute Psychiatric Inpatient Unit at Stanford Hospital, Clinical Associate Professor of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. As well, we have Dr. Justin Chen, MD, MPH Psychiatrist at Massachusetts General Hospital, Associate Director of Medical Student Education and Psychiatry, Harvard Medical School. Additionally, we have Dr. Tracy Cross. Dr. Cross is with the Jody and Leighton Smith. He is a Jody and Leighton Smith Professor of Psychology and Gifted Education, Executive Director of the Center for Gifted Education at William & Mary. And last but not least, Andy Mahoney.
I'll tell you who I am. I'm the Director of the Center for Identity Potential. I have counseling centers for gifted and talented in Chicago and Detroit and Fort Myers, Florida. I'm
going to turn the screen over now to Dr. Hu, who will begin the panel discussions. Dr. Hu, we'll turn the screen over to you now.
Very good, thank you. I was asked to participate in this webinar because of some work that we've been doing for parents of teens, particularly originally starting with Asian American teens. So I'm going to see if I can show my screen in just a moment. We have a website called stanfordcheapow.com. So let me show my screen. So it's www.stanfordcheapow.com, and Cheapow stands for Communication Health Interactives for Parents of Adolescents and Others. The background is that we had a series of suicides in our community in Palo Alto in 2015, and when we did panels for the parents, they started to ask us if they could, if we could show them, not tell them, better communication skills for communicating with their teenagers, because of course everyone wanted to, but not everyone was sure how to do it. One of the things that we realized originally with the East Asian parents, and now we've expanded to South Asian and Latino parents, is that when immigrant parents come to the United States, no one gives them a brochure that says your guide to the American teenager. So a lot of miscommunications happen between the young people and their parents, and it's not that anyone wants to miscommunicate, but that they come from a set of different assumptions. So we have a series of vignettes. These are mini plays in which we show first the way it really happened, and then the way that it could go a little bit better. So we have, they're all very short, only a few minutes each. They have names such as "You Should Have Studied," "What's Wrong with You?" That's one in which the teen has been cutting, and the parents, instead of saying, "What's wrong with you?" which sounds very accusatory, if they're able to say, "Sweetie, what's wrong?" They can do much better. A very popular topic is video games, so we have one called Game Boy. As you can see, I'm often the one who's playing the mom, but not invariably. So this is one of our faculty members, Dr. Amy Kiehl, playing the mom in this one. One of our Stanford undergraduates wrote a very moving one called Awkward Hug, about the differences in the expression of emotion between Asian parents and their offspring. One of my favorites is Unsuitable Boy, in which the teen brings home someone of a different ethnicity, and I, as the mother, react badly. And as I was saying, the vignettes cover a lot of different difficult situations that can arise between teens and parents. And I mentioned Unsuitable Boy was one in which the teen brings home someone that they want to date that I don't approve of. And then another one that I have pictured is called Parents Are So Embarrassing. And this one has been particularly moving for a lot of parents, East Asian, South Asian, and Latino, in which the young person, the teenager, makes fun of the parents' accent or what they're wearing or some of the customs. And we found that this is something that comes up with a lot of immigrant parents, is that they don't necessarily realize that American teenagers are brought up in more of an environment of equality and can often have behaviors that seem disrespectful to parents that were raised in other countries. If you're able to see the PowerPoint, some of the very sad statistics are that Asian American students are at a higher risk of suicide than their corresponding peers of the same age group. And this is not true of Asian Americans after a certain age, but it's definitely true in young people. It accounts for a larger proportion of deaths of 15 to 24-year-olds in Chinese and Japanese American students than in European Americans. They often have psychological concerns that could benefit from treatment but don't seek treatment. And they tend to underutilize the mental health services. One of the issues is that there's an overwhelming pressure to excel. There may be social isolation around it. And one of the things that has been shown in a number of studies is that this perfectionism that students are often raised with predicted suicidal ideation above and beyond hopelessness and depression among Asian Americans. Asian American college students tend to value perfectionism and are much more anxious about making mistakes. And so when a separate study than the one I originally mentioned looked at the amount of contribution of perfectionism, it was about 50% of the variance in depressive symptoms in Asian American students. So suicide is a problem among students and teens of many different ethnicities, but one of the interesting things is that the stressors are not the same in all different ethnicities, that among Asian Americans, and some of the studies include South Asians as well as East Asians. Among Asian Americans, perfectionism, family strife, and this pressure to excel is considered a higher stress and more associated with depression. So at this point, I actually haven't been keeping track of the time as well as I probably should have been. But let me pause for a second, and I know we're each supposed to speak for about 10 minutes, but this is a little bit of what we've been doing with our group at Stanford, and I'll be happy to answer questions as well.
I'd like to now introduce our second speaker, Dr. Justin Chen. Dr. Chen?
So I'm going to be speaking about, I was asked to talk a little bit about mental health challenges in high-achieving students from my vantage point, which is really as a cross-cultural psychiatrist. So I'm very interested in the role of culture and behavior, and particularly in Asian American families, meaning sort of East and South Asian, primarily who we work with, and predominantly Chinese, South Korean, and Indian families. So again, in terms of my own background, I'm a cross-cultural psychiatrist. I am a clinician and I see patients. I'm also a medical educator and I'm a researcher. I also helped to co-found this center 3 years ago now at this point, called the Massachusetts General Hospital Center for Cross-Cultural Student Emotional Wellness. If there's time at the end, I'll tell you more about that. I myself am a child of Chinese immigrants. I'm a second-generation Asian American, so I may be in a similar position as many of your own children. And in my clinical practice in Boston, I treat a number of, I guess you could call them high-achieving Asian American and Asian area students at sort of elite boarding high schools. And so again, I think Dr. Kiehl already, I love the work that they're doing over in Stanford, but I want to agree with her point that when we talk about Asians, it's an incredibly diverse group, and so it's hard to know who we're talking about. But for the sake of illustration, I'm going to talk about certain cases And one of those cases is Amy Kiehl, the original tiger mother, who wrote that all decent parents want to do what's best for their children. The Chinese just have a totally different idea of how to do that. And I think you could change Chinese to Korean, Indian, etc. Most cultures have an idea of what it means to raise a child well. So this is a little bit tongue-in-cheek. I don't know if the animation shows up for you all, but when you think about American success, and when we give talks to Asian American communities around the country, sometimes you think, okay, well, this is a pretty diverse vision of what success means. You could be sort of an inventor of new technology, a talk show host, a famous violinist, even a writer, even an Asian American writer or basketball player. These are all options. Sometimes, though, for Asian Americans, it seems like success might be a little more linear than that. And so sometimes it looks like the pictures on the screen where you take the little baby in the upper left, who then learns how to play the piano, wins the Intel science competition, goes to an Ivy League university, becomes a physician. And certainly I'm speaking somewhat from experience when I say that that was sort of the vision of what it means to do the best in this country. So going back to Amy Kiehl's points, I do think that all parents want very similar things for their kids, and that's denoted in the middle of the slide. Things like education, security, stability, relationships, health, and wealth. But my argument is that potentially culture plays a role in shifting the emphasis. And so that for some Asian families, there's much more of an emphasis on things like stability, obedience of the child to the parents in a hierarchical system, and then also this concept of impressiveness or face. This is a particularly Chinese concept, but I think it's shared in some of these collective cultures, that the student or the child should pursue things that can give your family face. Whereas in the West, there may be more of an emphasis on these cultural factors, such as following your dreams, being independent, and making a difference in the world. So how do we achieve success? Amy Kiehl says, make sure you come in first so that you have something to be humble about. An A- is a bad grade, and the only activities your children should be permitted to do are those in which they can eventually win a medal, and that medal must be gold. And so just to illustrate this point, I'm going to give you a case from my own clinical practice in Boston. Linda is a 21-year-old Asian American senior at an elite university. She graduated at the top of her high school class, but then she struggled in college to choose a major and a career path. She now feels constantly disappointed in her past choices and believes she wasted her higher education with what she described as a mediocre 3.5 GPA and no job in sight. When I saw her, she felt very lost. She was constantly comparing herself negatively to her classmates, and she spent all her free time on these websites that sort of people gossip or compare notes about various competitive internships and consulting jobs that they would apply for. And during therapy, she basically told me, I don't know what I'm doing, that life was easier when there were these hoops you had to jump through. If any of you are familiar with Bill Derezowitz's book, Excellent Sheep, I think some of these students that I see in my practice very much typify what he describes. Students who sort of know what it means to excel on paper, but don't really understand what for. And so again, just as Dr. Hu said, I think a lot of the challenge of this type of perfectionistic thinking that Amy Kiehl espouses is that it can contribute to sort of unhelpful thinking styles that we as psychiatrists and clinicians know are associated with poor mental health outcomes. In fact, often with patients, we see what we call something called the perfectionistic cognitive distortion, or an unhelpful thinking style. This is your classic black and white thinking. If it's not perfect, it's terrible. And studies, as Dr. Hu had mentioned, have found that Asian American students with perfectionistic thinking are actually more vulnerable to developing depression. And here's another example from my practice, a Harvard junior who said, in my mind, I have to get an A or I'm a failure. If it's not perfect, I don't hand it in. I have never handed in an assignment on time the whole time I've been at Harvard. And so this is sort of to illustrate, sometimes there's a feeling that, well, once we get into this very elite or exclusive school or program or whatever it is, that's all we need, then we've made it. But actually, as mental health clinicians, we want to take a much longer view and think about the long term. As mentioned, suicide is a leading cause of death for all Americans who are in the college age range, but that Asian Americans are more likely to have suicidal thoughts and actually to attempt suicide than whites. And very concerningly, Asian American women aged 15 to 24 had the second highest rate of completed suicide, second only to Native Americans. So these statistics are alarming. And I just put this photo here to show one of our collaborators here in Boston, who is a Korean American researcher named Chris Ham, who's done terrific work with young second generation Chinese, Korean, and Vietnamese women who endorsed suicidal or self-injurious behavior thoughts. And she's really one of the first people to be doing qualitative interviews with these groups to understand what are the factors that contribute to these negative mental health outcomes. Just very briefly, I will say, there's a lot of research now, neuroscientific, neurohormonal, and neuroimaging research that clearly demonstrates that chronic stress is harmful to both physical and mental health. And I think that's probably intuitive to you, but if anyone wants, I'm happy to share references, particularly from a neuroscientist at Rockefeller Institute in New York City called Bruce McEwen, who's done a lot of great work in this area. Something that we like to teach parents is this idea of the Yerkes-Dodson law, the inverted view of performance, in which you can see that actually there's an optimal level of stress. It's not that you don't want your kids to have stress. Obviously, stress is a part of life, but that as stress increases, well, if there's too little stress, an organism, be it a mouse or a person, will experience boredom and depression and disengagement. So you need a certain level of stress in order to be engaged and have an optimal level of function. But obviously, if that level of stress gets too high and the organism cannot sort of tolerate it or manage to cope with it, that then leads to burnout and a decrease in performance, happiness, and health. And so again, from Dr. McEwen's work at Rockefeller, we know that not all stress is bad. So the modern neuroscience is bearing out what that early Yerkes-Dodson curve showed. And so there are such things as positive and tolerable stress. The issue with toxic stress, and you can see here, that's when the person or organism feels that they don't have social and emotional support, and they don't have a sense of control or mastery. And finally, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the role of parenting in kids' emotional health. Diana Baumrind, who's an educator and psychologist, had sort of created this model that looks at warmth on one axis and control on the other. And we can just go ahead and shade out the low control axis, because we know for many Asian American parents, they're mostly high control. But really the difference between these two, authoritarian and authoritative parenting, comes down to the level of warmth. And according to Baumrind, the authoritative parent on the left is the more adaptive. So authoritarian parents are the classic tiger parents. These are ones who are strict and flexible, and they punish rather than discipline, as opposed to authoritative, where you still have a high control, you still demand a lot from your child, but you also have a nurturing and warm approach and open communication, which is often lacking in Asian American families. So in my own clinical experience working with Asian families, I found that parents may have good intentions, but often due to a variety of reasons, communication is actually quite challenged between the two generations. And so from the students' perspective, who are the ones I see in my practice, they feel that their parents are not listening and are validating. Meanwhile, from the parents' perspective, I understand that in Asian families, direct communication may not be as valued, and often communication may be more indirect through acts of service, such as through food or transportation and things like that. But I think growing up in an American context, this clash of cultures can be extremely emotionally challenging for students. And so finally, I'll end my talk by saying, one size does not fit all. And to give you the analogy of these two plants, the bamboo and the orchid. And so what I would say is, if you have these plants, you obviously would not give them the exact same level of nurturing or care. You would actually end up killing one or the other depending on what you gave. So you obviously want to tailor that to who your child is. And the only way to really understand who your child is communication. That will end. Thanks very much.
To go right ahead and introduce Dr. Tracy Cross, who is joining us. Dr. Cross, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, it's been great to hear the first two presenters. I'm going to adapt some of my presentation to not duplicate too many things. So it'll be a little less, it will be a little more disjointed than perhaps otherwise. little bit of background. I'm a neuropsychologist who specializes in the suicidal behavior of gifted students. I'm particularly interested in middle school through early entrance to college. And so I started doing research on via psychological autopsies in 1994. And over the past 23 years, we've conducted about 10 of those. They're very labor intensive and take a long time. Maybe if I got better at it, it wouldn't take as long, but it takes a long time. And so we've also conducted another 30 studies of different types, trying to come to understand what we can that would help inform people who are particularly interested in children with gifts and talents. As noted very well, it's very difficult to say things that would reflect equally well across different communities in the United States, different locations, and so forth. I like to say that gifted kids are the most heterogeneous group to study because they can vary the most on the most number of variables. And you add culture, you add region, you add socioeconomic status, and you find that there really are some important ways in which people vary. The last depiction of the two plants is really a nice way to show that, I think. These psychological autopsies gave us some hints about some things, and I'll report to you a few things that might be helpful. I came to William & Mary about 10 years ago and started an institute for research on the suicide of gifted students. And we focus primarily on young adolescents through college. And one of the nice things, unfortunately, I get to do, but it's still nice nevertheless, is I get to travel around the U.S. to locations where there have been contagions, or what at least look like contagions. And so William & Mary, for example, our little university here, a couple of years back, had 5 suicides in the academic year. It was the same year that MIT had a large number, and a high school in Northern Virginia had a large number, and a large number there in Palo Alto. And so when these things occur, obviously they get a lot of attention and they worry people for any number of reasons. So I've tried to come up with a model, and I don't really have a good one yet, but one that focuses on these high achieving communities, what we can learn about them specifically. And so that's sort of where I'm paying a lot of attention these days, is trying to see what I can learn from high achieving communities. And I have an analogy there that's helpful. It's helpful in thinking about it. So for example, if you think about the fact that every year tens of thousands of lightning strikes hit the United States, and some of them catch fire. As a matter of fact, in the western third of the United States now, a good many, a high percentage of them will cause fires. But you get up to the Pacific Northwest in certain areas where you have rainforests, and when these lightning strikes hit, they very seldom cause a fire. And that's analogous, I think, to some of these high-achieving communities, where once a suicide occurs in these communities, it's like dried kindling, and it becomes a potential catalyst for others to follow. Now, I don't want to say much more than that because I don't have much more to say, but it is worth thinking in that way because it can help you plan strategies to help prevent suicides. So my model that I like to use at our institute is that of a lifespan model rather than a medical model. The research, as I read it and as I see it, that's done in providing service to kids who were once identified as imminent harm, I think the people who serve those kids are just terrific. They know what they're doing, they know how to do it, and quite often they're successful. But they're competing against a lot of myths, and these myths become dangerous in how we attempt and need to be able to help the kids. So I'm tending tonight to focus more on the serious aspects of suicide. As noted, suicide ideation is important. It virtually always exists before you have a suicide. And so what we've tried to capture, and we're still working on this, is what are aspects to the life of our highest ability children that might someday be associated with suicidal behavior. Now, I personally think that a good many of them would be the same as for the general population, but there are some things that are rather unique to them. Experiences that could not happen to other people, for example. if you're a student of, say, immense potential and you're seen as that when you're young, then people will change the expectations they have for you. Plus, you're going to learn along the way, wherever you happen to live, there are going to be certain degrees of acceptability of how you are as a person, how you're perceived to be. And what we found is that a good many gifted kids experience what we call a stigma of giftedness. Now, clearly, this is affected by the community in which they're being raised. In rural communities where there might not even be a critical mass of gifted students, you have a different kind of complexion. As you move into these high achieving communities, and what you find is kids who would be the very top student elsewhere might be in the top 80% in this particular location. So you add the expectations, the chronic efforts at success, the trade-offs socially to do the schoolwork, the ways in which children internalize messages that aren't even intended from their parents sometimes, and you put it all together over time and you create the kids we're seeing at William and Mary. I work a lot with the student affairs people behind the scenes because we find that a lot of our students are requiring counseling. And as mentioned, quite often they won't pursue it. Again, my colleagues who work in the health aspect of college student life are really quite remarkable, I find, and they have a good many programs to bring the students into the process of positive mental health. And we have a wide range from a chaplaincy to some very sophisticated counseling and just health in broader terms. So universities are becoming, I think, increasingly astute about the nature of the opportunities these kids need to stay healthy in an environment that can be overwhelming. Now, one of the things we haven't talked about much, and I'll just sprinkle it in now, is especially once you get to college age, which is the potential for the influence of alcohol and drugs. When these kids get to campus and are feeling the kind of stressors that were described and have the expectations as perceived, and you add the social experiences that aren't always positive, and in some cases, college campuses can be places that are rather threatening to students of different backgrounds, and you add alcohol or other forms of drugs, and then you've got a pretty potent concoction leading to issues of mental health that, of course, can include suicide ideation. So I want to be cognizant of time and make sure I don't take Andy's time. So let me just summarize by saying that we can't determine the prevalence rates of gifted kids right now relative to suicide ideation or completion, because our data aren't kept that way per se, not at the national level. And from our research on suicide ideation among gifted kids, it's slightly promising in as much as it seems to be at or slightly below the average range across the databases that establish the norms. But as we've already heard, that's going to vary significantly across groups. Another thing, this is what worries me, but I don't have enough data to say more, but saying it to my colleagues is a way to express myself too. What worries me is that our psych autopsies have taught me that a good many of these kids we've studied at least have kept journals, daily basis for several months. And in those journals, they describe with great detail how they're going to take their life, when they're going to take it, where, the materials they need, and so forth. And so I worry that their attempts to completion ratio is lower, that the prevalence rates of ideation might be similar, and but I'm fearful that they might have fewer attempts per completion. I can't say that I know that, but just reading their journals, it's certainly a reasonable thing to worry about at this point. I had one more point, but I've lost it. So I'll just stop there and turn it over to Andy.
Dr. Cross, thank you very much. Andy Mahoney, it is 8:47. I want to give you as much time as possible, but I also want to make sure that we have time for some of the questions that have already come in for today's session. So to the degree that you can, please be as brief but as thorough and comprehensive as possible. Thank you very much.
Okay, there we go. So for the sake of time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to briefly show you, this is a model that I developed over the last probably 30 years that we use in the counseling and the training of counselors to work with the gifted. It's called the FIT at this point. It is now a very complex software product and process that I use. But overall, it has to do with looking at far more variables than what people typically look at that go into the identity formation of a healthy, gifted person or an individual in terms of any aspect of identity. So as you can see on the left of that grid, there is a whole list of variables. These are just a few of the variables we look at. So one of my processes is that we really need to look at far more variables than psychological variables or just developmental variables and cultural variables. We have to look at all these variables. So what I do is I look at the interface between all the systems, both internal and external, that impact an individual's identity formation. And that has to do with the impact on their well-being. So I have a phrase when I look at this clinically is that identity disturbance is the etiology and or exacerbation of all pathology. So when people are not living in a life that fits them and in an interactive relationship with all the variables that impact their identity formation, that they activate pathologies. And when they're living in their fit, then what happens is that their potential is activated. And I mean that on everything from the developmental to the neurological to the developmental, intellectual, emotional development. So all aspects of human nature. Well, one of the things that we haven't talked about this evening is mental illness as it relates to intelligence. So one of the first studies that I did many, many years ago was looking at the relationship between mental illness and intelligence. And a lot of people get trapped in the typical research dilemma of linear correlation. And the reality is this: there's a relationship between intelligence and mental illness. And in some cases, there is a linear correlation. And we know for a fact that mood disorders in particular, bipolar, there are relationships between high intelligence. And we also know that people who kill themselves are typically suffering from a mood disorder. So we know that giftedness and intelligence is a variable in the process. And there's a lot of subtleties. Tracy you all talked a lot about different systems, and Tracy, you spread that around a little further, which I appreciate in terms of variables. So I like people not to lose sight of the fact that there are overlapping issues with mental illness. Another one in particular is compulsive disorder. Anxiety is another one. So let's just take obsessive compulsive disorder. You rarely ever find obsessive compulsive disorder in average intelligence in terms of human beings. But when you get into the concept of high intelligence, you're talking about a vulnerability in the bio-developmental neurosystem of the human being. And I look at it more as human nature in extreme. And people have all kinds of predispositions. And there just happens to be some gifted people who have these predispositions. And then all these variables are like, I took what Tracy was saying more as the perfect storm. So when you look at issues, particular stressors that may come from culture, as we were talking about with the Asian population, that is a huge variable stressor when it comes to activating mental illness in a human being. And if we took a child from another cultural standpoint, it may not be the same based on where our society is and our culture is. And that alone is an important variable. We can look at it from different perspectives though. The other thing we didn't talk about tonight was what happens between 15 and 24. It's the development of the prefrontal cortex. And every one of you have noted that period, but what we don't understand enough about is how the development of the prefrontal cortex impacts the gifted individuals. And the reality is this: gifted people have what we call asynchronous development, and I don't look at that from the romantic perspective. I look at it from the pure neurobiological developmental aspect. So we have gifted people who are far advanced in certain aspects of their intelligence as it comes to the brain, and their prefrontal cortex development can actually be normal, but the impact because of the deviance between those two general aspects of the brain, that alone itself can create stressors that when they go into young adulthood and their prefrontal cortex can't function like it did before, that alone can put activation on predispositions when it comes to mental illness. So that's enough of that. Any thoughts? I don't know if I wrapped it up at all for you there, Bill.
No, thank you very much. I appreciate it, Andy, Dr. Hu, Dr. Chen, and Dr. Cross. At this time, we are closing in on what is supposed to be the conclusion of the webinar. But with the indulgence of our panelists, what I would like to do now is open up to questions. So please, if you have questions, by all means, you can type them into your screen. There's a panel for you where you can do this. We have some questions already that we can talk with. Panelists, if you do have to leave because of other commitments, we certainly understand. But for those of you who can stay for a few more minutes, we would appreciate that indulgence. I do have a question here from someone, and so I'll read it. And this question will be for, I'll put it for Dr. Hu. Dr. Hu, this is from one of the questions that came into us. My son is in his second year of an elite STEM PhD program, has entered into a self-defeating spiral similar to one that almost derailed him as an undergrad, where he can't get himself to do the work he needs to do to stay afloat and hates himself for it, and it's a self-propagating spiral. He feels helpless. He's experimenting with treatment for the first time, has a therapist he likes, and is currently trying a couple of different drugs, Cetera and Zoloft. It's too soon to tell if they will help. He's considering voluntarily taking a semester off as mental health leave and staying in the city he's in, it's on the other side of the country, to do so. What can I do as a parent to best support and help him? Dr. Hu?
That's a great question. And, you know, it's very brave of him to be working on this now. He has a very good combination of things where he's doing both therapy and medications at the same time. It used to be considered something where you had to choose, which is silly because there's no reason you have to do just one or the other. So I think that's very good, and that he has a therapist that he likes. As a parent, letting him know that you support him, that you won't always know the answers, but that you are part of the journey with him. So there are going to be times when you wish that you could just say, you know, do this or do that, but keep the dialogue going. I think it's a very natural tendency. I am the mother of a teenager myself, and I know that there's often a tendency to want to sort of go in and rescue. So be open to what he asks for from you. There's going to be times that he's going to want just to talk and let you know what he's thinking, but you don't need a solution. There's going to be times that he'll get frustrated, and you need to know that it's okay to both be frustrated. Let him know when you're concerned, but realize that for a lot of young people, concern can sound like anger, and so when you're worried about him, have it be that you're both on the same side of the issue and not adversaries.
Dr. Hu, thank you very much. We have another question in. This one I'll point to Dr. Chen. Are mental health issues more prevalent in the highly gifted populations, and what is the evidence of that?
It actually sounds like that one should go to one of the following two speakers, because I think they actually specifically reference that. I mean, I can speak from my clinical experience, but I see who I see. So I don't know if Andy or Dr. Cross would like to talk about their work with high ability.
Andy, Dr. Cross, would either of you like to field this question? Are mental health issues more prevalent in the highly gifted populations? And if so, what is the evidence of that?
Go ahead, Tracy.
Well, I'll take a stab at it, but if you correct me, I'll just turn off my picture and my sound. I personally don't think that there's a much higher incidence of serious mental health among the most able or very able people. I do worry a little bit that those we traditionally identify as the most different, and that can be on things other than just, say, pure intelligence, as we might characterize it to be. Art, for example, that when you get out on the extreme ends of the curve, I think that communication becomes exceedingly difficult. Some of the things that developmentally children naturally develop skills at or are taught by their families can be more difficult. If you're, For example, some of the kids I've seen over the years, a second grade girl who can do calculus. If you're that kind of student, that kind of child, who is your peer? And as Andy mentioned, the notion of asynchronous development, for a lot of these kids, they don't necessarily develop the quality of interpersonal skills that they need to be able to transcend all the prejudices and all the differences. And so it can be a lonely life for some of them. But I don't think that equates into mental illness per se. I think it can equate into loneliness and some other things that then can go into mental illness, especially when they, medicate it. But we have seen, and past, as Andy has said, there are certain patterns that we do tend to see when you look sociologically at it. But I personally, because my experience has been less from one-on-one counseling and more from running schools and dealing with large numbers of very, very high achieving students, is that if you look at that group, what you tend to find are certain sub-patterns, but they stay within a normal range. So for example, of the students that are there, say at this one school I worked at for 9 years, their achievement is extremely high, their perfectionism is relatively high, their attention to details high, as you would expect, their commitment to academic things, their study habits, there's litany of things that establishes one's pattern of being successful that follows them in these environments. Now, my personal experience has been in those kinds of academic environments. My experience was residential. These kids were so happy to be in an environment where they were not aberrant, where they were seen as average, typical, okay, nothing special, even to the point where they wanted to stay there if they fell into the bottom quartile in terms of achievement at the school. They still loved that environment of being surrounded by, it's a type of homophily, I would argue, but it's more than that. Being accepted is really important, in my opinion, to mental health, perceiving that. And for gifted kids, being surrounded by other gifted kids is about the closest thing we have to an antidote. And for some kids, it's at college where they experience this, or for some, graduate school. But for some, it's those who have especially good schools along the way. And I think residential schools, if they're kind, gentle, and supportive environments, I think they head off some of these kinds of problems. I do not personally think that there's enough evidence to say that very high achieving people are predisposed to mental health problems.
Thank you, Dr. Cross. I appreciate that. Here's one that just came in, and for Dr. Chen or Andy Mahoney, I'd love to hear your comments on this. The question is this: as a parent, what should we pay attention to? Are there any lists of things that we can follow instead of seeing doctors? I see lots of smiles on the panel. Who would like to field that one?
I mean, maybe I'll take a stab, and then Andy, feel free as well. I mean, I think this, I like the spirit of the question, because sometimes what we say to parents is that my preference would be that people don't end up in my office, actually, right? Like if we can go earlier and find ways to prevent people, like, raise awareness and education about in parents and families and students about what are healthy practices so that it doesn't get to that point. That's fantastic. I'm not sure whether the question is getting at, are there lists of things that we should be looking out for that would be warning signs, which is a common question, or is it a list of things that we should be doing to prevent mental illness? I can quickly speak to both. In terms of the symptoms of common mental illnesses, a lot of them are actually quite physical. So you might notice things like sleep being disrupted, appetite, energy level, etc. And obviously the one that we take very seriously is if someone starts to talk about having thoughts about self-harm or suicidality. That's already a sign of pretty severe illness, and I think that should be referred to see a professional. In terms of things we can follow to promote mental and physical health, I mean, these are things that are pretty basic, actually. I think they're things we all recognize. So as I mentioned, a lot of the early signs of mental health problems are physical. So maintaining good attention to diet, exercise, sleep. These are sort of the foundations of general health, both physical and mental. I guess maybe, go ahead, sorry.
Both something that can be a sign of a problem, but it's also good sleep helps prevent a problem. So that's worth paying attention to. So sorry to interrupt, but
no, absolutely.
Let me add to this. One of the problems is that people don't know enough about what giftedness really is. So there's not enough information out there for people to understand the neurological, biological, and developmental nature of high intelligence. And so if parents become educated about the developmental nature, the neurological nature, the biological nature, and they start to understand the differences in all of those aspects of human intelligence in an extreme, and they start to put it into an appropriate context. So their expectations, their interventions, the way they relate to their child is effective and appropriate. Then they can start to have a relationship with their child and with the world that helps facilitate a healthy development of that gifted child. And there's a lot more to know about gifted children than what we know. And right now, most of it comes from the field of education. And it shouldn't just come from psychology. It needs to come from a lot of perspectives in terms of our awareness of who these people are as human beings in their own right, in their own extremes.
I agree. And the reason we all were smiling about, instead of seeing a doctor is I always tell patients, we're here if you need us, but it's even better when you don't need us. And the project that I was talking about is something that we've been doing at Stanford separate from our day jobs. So what I do at Stanford is to run an acute inpatient unit where students and, well, people in general come to when they've had a suicide attempt or suicidal thoughts. But we realized that we really wanted to try to do something before they get to that point. We don't want to just be the safety net. We want to do something about being able to walk the balance beam before they fall off. So one thing that I think is helpful for parents of gifted teens and youngsters, students to know is that in the United States, the success is not like a ladder. It's not completely linear. I think Dr. Chen was also talking about this, that in the United States, it's much more like a mountain. And so many of the parents coming from countries where it is linear and where, for example, in Silicon Valley, every Indian engineer that I know went to IIT. And obviously there are other schools in India, but people who go to IIT end up in Silicon Valley, and the people in Silicon Valley that didn't go to IIT, well, they wouldn't end up here. So what I'm saying is that the parents perceive from where they come from that there's this very linear ladder, and if you reach for a rung and miss, then you fall off and tumble to the bottom of the ladder. In the United States, it's much more like a mountain. There's many different ways of success. I like very much Dr. Chen's slide of all the different ways in which you can succeed. And I also like the slide where it mentioned Steve Jobs, who everyone can agree is gifted, but didn't follow the usual paths. He went to a college that isn't particularly well known. It's not one of the Ivies, and then he dropped out. And he was fired from the company that he founded. I mean, there's so many things he talked about at the commencement address at Stanford that were untraditional and would be considered failures. And so for gifted youngsters and their parents to know that there's not just one path, and that a perceived failure in one area doesn't mean the end of the world.
Dr. Hu, thank you very much. Also, Andy Mahoney, Justin Chen, and Dr. Cross. Everyone, thank you very much for extending your time. I know we have a few questions, and I just want the audience to know that if you will submit your questions to us, we will do our best to feed them to the panel and get some responses from them, and then redistribute them back to you. Unfortunately, we are at the conclusion of our extended time, so I'd like to take this moment to thank each of our panelists, participants, for their time and their wisdom tonight. You were fantastic. I learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone else did as well. I'd also like to thank the participants who joined us. I know there was a little trouble at the beginning, but many of you did, and I'm happy about that, so thank you very much. Your questions were wonderful and added to the value of the topic discussion. I'd like you all to know that a recorded version of this webinar will be available very soon. You'll be able to find it at our website at www.cee.org. That's www.cee.org. Once again, thank you all for taking part tonight. This concludes the webinar. We welcome your feedback and support here at the Center for Excellence in Education. Have a good night, everyone.